In October 2016, Robbie and Jennifer Tower bought 2 tickets to Ukraine, and at that point both were absolutely certain they were flying to bring back someone who would become part of their family. They brought him back to Florida, to their home in Northport, and for a while, everything went exactly as they had planned. But a few years would pass, and the one they had flown across the ocean for would lock the door in their own home, and what happened behind that door would become the basis of a criminal case. Northport is a small city in Sarasota County, Florida. Private homes, wide streets, neighbors who know each other by name. Robbie and Jennifer had lived here for several years. Both worked as real estate agents. Both were deeply religious and regularly participated in missionary trips. They had traveled to many countries. Neighbors described them to journalists briefly. 2 genuinely good, caring people. Their family had stayed just the 2 of them for a long time. Not by choice, that's just how it worked out. And then at some point, they made the decision to adopt. Not a baby, not a toddler, but a teenager. And not from the local foster care system, but from Ukraine, a place few people travel to with that purpose. During the Christmas season of that same year, 2016, Jennifer wrote a post on Facebook. They had brought home a son. He was 14. No one in their circle questioned the decision. And Warren Rhines would later say that they used their lives for good. So this was not an impulsive idea. The couple deliberately sought out someone who needed a family the most, a teenager from an orphanage, from the other side of the ocean, where almost no one flies for that reason. This person, the answer to this question, would take several years, and 9 years later, it would be read aloud in a courtroom. During questioning, Dima described himself in one phrase, "Nobody coming from nowhere," and if you lay out his story by the facts, that phrase turns out to be not a pose and not an attempt to evoke pity, but an accurate description of what he went through. He was about 6. At trial, he would say he does not remember exactly, the way it happens when you lose someone too early and too far from anything that could be called a normal life. After that, an older brother, then an uncle, he never stayed with anyone longer than a few months. His biological father, according to the defense attorney, simply did not want to bother. And so, in the end, there was only one path left, an institution. Luhansk, eastern Ukraine. Warren Rhines, who would later see Dima already in Florida, would say he had bruises. When he was first taken out to eat at a cafe, he grabbed 6 sausages because he was not sure there would be more. Those institutions are like a prison, Rhines would say. In 2015, the conflict began in eastern Ukraine, and the government started evacuating children from Luhansk institutions to safer areas of the country. Enter the Towers, missionaries from Florida, who by that time had already visited Ukraine several times. According to case materials, they met him back in 2013, and in 2015, he moved in with them. In 2016, the adoption was made official. He did not speak English, and the country where he grew up was already being torn apart. The Towers gave him a home in Northport, a school, their last name. Robbie wrote on Facebook, __quote_0__Jennifer made borscht for school lunch and brought it as a dish from the country he came from. That is what was visible from the outside. But what was happening on the inside would become clear much later. Up until this point, everything that happened in the house on Malacot Road stayed within the family. But in December 2018, 2 years after the official adoption, Northport police were called to the address for the first time. By then, Dima had already dropped out of school before finishing 10th grade. He had learned English, but he did not stay in the classroom. On December 8th, Jennifer told officers that Dima had pushed her when she entered his room. Dima denied it. According to Demir, Robbie, during the same visit, asked to have Dima sent for a mandatory psychiatric evaluation, but the officers refused. The situation, in their view, was not serious enough. That was the first call, not the last. In April of 2019, 2 calls in a single night. Dima leaves the house on a bicycle, angry about being grounded. They find him, bring him back. He leaves again. They bring him back again. In July of the same year, he is stopped near a school. He had a pellet gun on him. His explanation: he wanted to shoot at toy soldiers he had in his pocket, and Warren Rhines would later describe Dima of those years briefly. He was interested in boxing, but he did not want to box. He wanted to hit. He wanted to cause pain. A classmate who gave an interview to a local station with her face hidden said essentially the same thing. He was looking for fights. From the outside, it was still a family with a Facebook story, borscht, and mini golf. Inside, police reports that had already started piling up in the archives. The Towers, meanwhile, did not give up. They did not dissolve the adoption. They did not send him back into the system. Why will this question become truly important a little later? For now, something else matters. By the end of 2019, the number of police calls had already reached several incidents, and one of them would change the atmosphere in the house irreversibly. In October 2019, Robbie Tower called the police and asked to have Dima removed from the house, a parent who does not know how to handle a teenager. The report documented something specific. Dima was physically and verbally aggressive, but separately, one detail that stands apart from everything else. Robbie told officers that every night he locked the bedroom door from the inside with a key because he was afraid of the person he himself had brought across the ocean. This is no longer anxiety or parental exhaustion. This is a specific decision made in a specific house, behind a lock because the person on the other side inspires fear. And Robbie Tower was not a weak person. His neighbors called him the unofficial mayor of the street. He was the one who sought out this teenager, processed the paperwork, and flew to get him himself. And now he was locking himself in the bedroom. The officer tried to talk to Dima. Dima did not respond. What exactly happened between them before that call is not documented in the records. Most likely there was a specific incident that became the final breaking point, and not just one. As Warren Rhines would later mention, Dima once left Robbie with a bruise under his eye, and it was then that he was temporarily sent to live with Jennifer's relatives. By the timeline, this fits right into this period. But even after that, the Towers did not give up on him. Robbie insisted that he come back. They forgave him for everything, Rhines would say. And yet, the locked door never went away. It appeared and became part of the reality that Dima saw every day from inside the house. Between 2020 and 2023, Dima left the house and came back several times. The pattern repeated, and every time, the Towers took him back. According to testimony from relatives and friends at trial, during this time the couple spent their savings and took out loans. They gave him a car, citizenship. They continued to pay for him in the literal sense. Someone put it this way: they bought him everything he wanted or needed, and added separately, speaking of Robbie, that is how much he loved him. And here it is worth pausing, because the person who slept behind a locked door was the very same person who then insisted on Dima's return, took out loans, and who, according to those close to him, continued to believe that everything could still be fixed. Witnesses at trial described a couple for whom Dima was their only chance to become parents. They never had children of their own. He was the one for whom they kept coming back, again and again. And they, as eyewitnesses would later say, were determined to use that chance no matter what. From the outside, it looked like stubbornness or faith, or probably both. Dima, meanwhile, lived in a house where he was both loved and feared. What exactly he thought about that, he never said aloud. On August 31st, 2023, he came home in the evening. According to prosecutor Liana Whipple, based primarily on his own statements to the investigator, he went to his room and started drinking alone. He did not turn on the television and did not go to sleep. He sat and thought. During questioning, he would tell detectives that the thought of what he was about to do came to him twice, once that evening and again later that night. And here it is important to understand one thing. This was not an outburst and not a breakdown. Between the thought and the action, there was time. He sat in his room, and that thought did not leave while he drank. While he sat in silence while the Towers slept on the other side of the wall, it simply stayed with him. At some point, he got up, left the room, and walked to the kitchen. In the holder stood kitchen knives. He took a steak knife and went back toward the bedroom. The door, this time, was not locked from the inside. What exactly was going through his mind during those hours, he never explained clearly. During questioning, he said only, quote 1, and added, quote 2, and so most likely. That is his answer. Not evasion, but precisely an answer. Something had been building for years, and that night it crossed the point after which he no longer tried to stop himself. He walked down the dark hallway with a weapon in his hand. Robbie was asleep. Dima entered the dark bedroom and struck first at the neck. Robbie did not have time to react, and after that, the strikes did not stop. The Sarasota County medical examiner, Russell Vega, would later determine 68 wounds: face, back, neck, the back of the head, side, shoulder, arm. The cause was loss from injuries to the neck and major arteries. At some point, the first weapon was lost. Apparently it got stuck or slipped from his hands. Dima left the bedroom, went back to the kitchen, took a second one, and went back. Jennifer woke up. She saw what was happening and tried to protect her husband. This is documented in the case materials. Then she realized she could not, and she ran. She ran out of the house barefoot in her nightclothes to the neighboring house. She pounded on the door, screaming. And Dima did not stay in the bedroom. He did not hide. He did not panic. He followed her out. What exactly happened in those seconds between his leaving the house and what came next is not reconstructed minute by minute in the testimony, but the direction of movement is known. He went after her. Those were not seconds. That was time during which one could have stopped. He did not stop. And when Jennifer ran from the house, he did not stop either. Neighbor Jonah Walton heard knocking at the door and then a voice, quote 3 Walton dialed 911. The dispatcher told her not to open the door, to wait for police. When she finally looked out, there was evidence on the doorstep. Jennifer was no longer there. Dima had caught up with her. She was brought back inside the house. How exactly this happened, at what point he reached her, is not reconstructed in the materials, but the result is documented. She ended up inside. He sat her down on the couch and began telling her what he had done to Robbie. And this is no longer rage in the conventional sense, because in rage, you do not think. And here was a person who had just committed the act, chased down a fleeing woman, brought her back, sat her down, and began talking. Why? He never explained. What she responded is also not preserved in the case materials, and this gap in the records feels sharper than any detail. Then 79 strikes. Medical examiner Vega would document injuries to the face and neck, 38 of them specifically to those areas. Jennifer was found face down. Police were already on their way from Walton's call. Minutes remained before their arrival. Northport police arrived in response to the 911 call shortly before midnight. In the house on Malacott Road, Robbie and Jennifer Tower. Both face down, head to head, evidence on the carpet in the living room. Traces on the walls near Robbie's bed, on the couch, in the kitchen, in the hallway, on the inside of the front door. Medical examiner Vega counted no fewer than 140 strikes total between the two. Behind the nightstand in the bedroom, one weapon was found. The other, with Dima's DNA on the handle and traces on the blade, had been washed and returned to the holder on the kitchen counter. And this detail definitively destroys any version of impulse or temporary loss of control. A person in a state of mental break does not stop to wash a weapon, does not return it to its place, does not think about the holder. That is the action of a person who is in control of what is happening and is already thinking about what comes next. When officers went outside, they saw Dima. He was standing by his black 2012 Chevrolet Sonic, loading things into the trunk. On his head and shoulders, evidence of what had occurred, same clothes as during the attack. Officers commanded him to stop. Dima got in the car and drove away. Officer Tyler Rogakas would record on the dashboard camera. Dima ignores commands, gets into the car, and pulls onto Toledo Blade Boulevard into oncoming traffic, heading north on I-75. The Sarasota County Sheriff's Office deployed spike strips at the 192-mile marker. In an unincorporated area near Venice, the car stopped. Dima abandoned it and went on foot into the woods. Then, 8 hours. The search involved Venice Police, the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office, and the Florida Highway Patrol. They combed through the wooded area near I-75 and Laurel Road. Night, August, Florida. Humidity, darkness, dense underbrush. Dima spent all that time there. On September 1st, 2023, at 7:30 in the morning, police in Venice apprehended him at a gas station on Jacaranda. Same clothes, same evidence now dried. He was not trying to flee further. He was simply standing at the gas station. And those 8 hours in the woods were not panic and not a flight to nowhere. That was a choice not to surrender immediately. What he did all that time in the darkness alone is unknown. But in the morning, he came out on his own. Not to the police, just to where they found him. He was taken in for questioning. Detectives wanted to know one thing. Why? A police station in Venice. Dima sits across from the detectives. Same clothes, same evidence. The recording of this interrogation would later be played at trial in its entirety. Detectives ask what happened that night. One word, rage. Then in fragments, he does not construct an explanation. He does not offer a version. He speaks in pieces, like someone who has no interest in being understood. I would have been better off staying in Ukraine. And then a phrase that does not fit any of those fragments. I'm not a good person. I was raised wrong. I didn't listen and did things I shouldn't have done. He acknowledges what he did directly, without bargaining, without attempting to lie. Detectives ask about a plan. There was no plan. I was temporarily out of my mind. But one line from this interrogation would resonate in the courtroom especially heavily. Not rage and not you wouldn't understand. Another one. Almost quiet, almost offhand. They didn't do anything to me. Not a justification, not an attempt to absolve himself, just a statement that explains nothing while simultaneously speaking to something he never named aloud. For 2 years before the trial, this would remain in the case files, and in November 2025, he would be asked again, this time in the courtroom. November 2025, Sarasota courtroom. Defense attorney Mark Gilman stands before the jury and begins immediately, not trying to prove that he did not do it. He did. The question is not that. The question is whether this was a premeditated act in the first degree, or whether it was unpremeditated. Gilman asks for a verdict on a lesser charge and builds his entire defense on this. A child whose relatives did not want to bother. He experienced the loss of his mother at the earliest age. He passed through several relatives, none of whom kept him. He ended up in an institution in a conflict zone. He arrived in a foreign country as a teenager to live with strangers. And this, according to Gilman, is not simply a biography. It is accumulated trauma that deforms a person before they even have a chance to become an adult. Gilman does not say the Towers were bad people. He says something else. Dima was a person who had been dealt too many wounds before he ever came to them. And they did not know how to deal with that. And he himself did not know how to live with it. While Gilman speaks, Dima in the courtroom covers his face with his hands. Then he begins crying loudly, so much so that Judge Krug halts the proceedings. She asks the bailiffs to escort the jurors out and gives him a few minutes. This is the first time throughout the entire process that he looks different. Not aggressive, not indifferent. The prosecution does not argue with the biographical facts. It argues with the conclusion, and it has 2 kitchen implements, a trail of evidence throughout the house, and a weapon returned to its holder. The prosecution built its case not on biography, but on the sequence of actions. DNA expert Charlene Webster took the stand with specific data. On the handle of the second implement, Dima's DNA. On the blade, traces belonging to Robbie Tower. This is not a reconstruction, this is a laboratory result. Then the root. Traces throughout the house reconstruct the pattern of movement, bedroom, kitchen. That is where Dima went for the second implement. Back to the bedroom, then the hallway, the front door, the street, the pursuit of Jennifer, the return, the couch. And all of this is documented not by words, but by physical evidence on the couch, in the kitchen, on the inside of the door. Prosecutor Whipple put it bluntly. He made a series of consecutive conscious decisions after everything was already done. He went out, washed the implement, returned it to its place, and started loading things into the car. A person in a state of temporary mental break does not act that way, not in that order, not methodically. Then came family and acquaintances of the Towers. Several people said essentially the same thing. Dima did not know how to accept rules, did not know how to accept authority, did not know how to accept the consequences of his own actions. As an explanation, simple, clear, fitting into a single line, a person who simply could not live by someone else's rules. But the numbers do not add up. 140 strikes is not a rebellion against authority. It is not a demonstration. An inability to accept rules does not explain that scale, and it does not explain the couch. Dima listened to all of this in silence, and then made the decision to take the stand himself, against the direct advice of Gilman. He took the stand. Gilman did not want this, too unpredictable, prone to conflict, but Dima insisted. First, direct questions from the defense attorney. Dima talks about himself. Luhansk, his mother, the institution, the conflict, Florida. He speaks for about 50 minutes. Then prosecutor Karen Freyvelich takes over. You took a sharp object and entered the bedroom. What were you thinking in that moment, walking toward them in the dark? I wasn't thinking about anything. What is there to think about? Then he says more. The Towers did not know how to handle a person with his past. He himself made their lives a living nightmare. His own word. He despised his life in America. Then, directly, without hesitation, those people were not my real parents. Did you decide to do this before you entered? Freyvelich asks. Yes. Then he again mentions temporary loss of control several times. The judge stops him. The defense of insanity had not been legally entered and was not supported by experts. Dima continues to argue with the prosecutor, with the judge, with the very course of the examination. And the courtroom sees a person who simultaneously acknowledges what he did and rejects any version that might explain it. A lot happened between the three of us, he says to the question of what he said to Jennifer on the couch. You're not listening. I'm answering your question. He is angry, not remorseful, and it is precisely in this testimony, almost in passing, between one remark and another, that he says one phrase, quiet, incidental, that changes everything. Among everything Dima said, there was one detail, almost in passing. Jennifer had at some point told him that Robbie had not originally wanted to adopt at all. Dima says this calmly, not as an accusation, not as an explanation, but as a fact he simply accepted and carried inside himself. Where it happened, when it happened, also unclear. In the case files, only his words are recorded. But now the entire timeline begins to look different. The locked bedroom door. The call to police asking to have Dima removed from the house. The words Robbie said to neighbors, that the adoption had ruined his marriage. All of this was already known to the court. But now one thing was added. Dima knew about it from the start. Robbie's reluctance. He knew it from Jennifer, the one who, by all accounts, loved him. The prosecution does not build a separate argument on this. Its position is already formed by the evidence. But the court notes this moment of testimony. The version about an inability to accept rules explains the conflict. But it does not explain why these two specific people, and with such rage. Most likely Jennifer was simply honest with him and did not think about what those words meant for a person with that history of rejection. Valery Kuzmin, differently. Relatives of the Towers speak in the courtroom without looking at Dima, or looking directly at him. __quote_16_ says someone close to the family. Robbie's grandfather on his father's side, Philip Tower, puts it differently. He says Robbie and Jennifer tried to make Dima into someone so he would not remain nobody from nowhere. But now in prison, he will be assigned a number instead of a name. And the only thing Philip wants from the person who carried his last name is for Dima to give it up. Then Dima is given the floor. Judge Krug warns him, do not say anything that would dishonor the memory of the deceased. Dima nods and begins. Quote 17 he opens, then that the testimony from witnesses was irrational, that in that moment he lost his mind. Then he veers into blaming the upbringing by his adoptive family. Judge Krug stops him. Dima shouts. Krug looks at him and says what would later appear in the headlines: 2 life sentences without the possibility of early release, consecutive, plus 5 years for the pursuit. Concurrent with the second sentence, the escorts lead him away. The courtroom empties. Let us return to what Dima said at trial, almost in passing. It is the only detail in the entire case through which everything else begins to fall into place. Facts already known to the court individually become explicable. The reaction to real incidents, the attempt to get help, the exhaustion of a person in a difficult situation. All of that is true. But for Dima, likely this was not a sum of separate facts. It was confirmation of one and the same thing, of what he may have believed since the age of 6. The place he ends up is not the place where he is wanted, and so the rage is real. It is not a version and not a reconstruction. He named it himself. The rage of a person who, every time he thought he had found a place, received a signal that he was not wanted there. An accumulated debt that is presented not when something happens, but when something inside stops holding together. The exact circumstances of that conversation with Jennifer are not in the case files. When exactly? Unknown. The exact words, also unknown. Only Dima's testimony exists, and beyond that, reconstruction based on everything the court heard over 3 days, the one that makes this story truly unbearable. During the interrogation in Venice before the trial, Dima said 3 words about himself: nobody coming from nowhere. At the time, it sounded like a self-description. Now it sounds like a sentence he passed on himself before Judge Krug ever did. The Towers tried to change exactly that. Not to fix him, not to re-educate him, but to make it so he would no longer be nobody. Now he has a number. Dima became literally what he spoke of: nobody, from nowhere. Only now it is no longer a feeling, but a fact. And here is the irony that is impossible to avoid. Jennifer loved him more than Robbie did, by all accounts. It was she who, without thinking of the consequences, told him the truth about Robbie not wanting the adoption. And so that honesty, refracted through years of rejection and locked doors, became part of what he carried into that bedroom, directed in part against her. The Towers lost their lives trying to make him into someone, and he remained what he always believed himself to be. Only now, it is forever. Like and subscribe to our channel. See you next time.